Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome back to the Islamic SHAHADA channel. Gould David was born and raised in the tranquil, isolated state of Tasmania, Australia. Unlike the religious mainstream in Australia, dominated by various Protestant denominations and Roman Catholicism, Gould felt drawn to the rich liturgical and spiritual heritage of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. In 1978, he formally embraced orthodoxy, not merely out of personal conviction, but also with a deep sense of commitment to a local Orthodox Christian community in Hobart that had long struggled without consistent clerical leadership. Since 1973, the community had lacked a permanent priest, and this vacuum of spiritual authority would persist until 1994. During this time, Gould stepped forward, not as an ordained minister initially, but as a deeply devoted layperson determined to help sustain the life and structure of the faith community. His involvement was driven by both necessity and a genuine sense of spiritual responsibility. While he did later serve as an ordained priest for a brief period of about 2 years, most of his time was spent as a highly active lay leader and unofficial spiritual guide within the local church. His dedication helped maintain regular liturgical practices, community gatherings, and a sense of religious identity for Orthodox Christians in Tasmania throughout decades of instability. Although some narratives have referred to him as having served as a priest for 45 years, this is more a reflection of his long-standing devotion and service to the church, rather than his actual time in ordained ministry. In truth, his role for most of those decades was as a layman who functioned with informal guidance from bishops and priests on the mainland, stepping in to lead prayers, organize services, and offer spiritual counsel when needed. His deep familiarity with Orthodox liturgy, theology, and pastoral needs earned him the respect of many within the local religious circle, even without holding official clerical status for most of that time. This extended period of grassroots religious service, rooted not in title but in practice, shaped his spiritual worldview profoundly. Gould's journey through orthodoxy was not static. It was dynamic and evolving, marked by sincere reflection, quiet doubts, and an ever-deepening search for truth. These early years laid the groundwork for what would become a deeply personal and transformative spiritual path, one that would eventually lead him, with humility and conviction, toward Islam. In 2022, Gould David found himself traveling to Perth, Western Australia, under somber circumstances. He had come to attend the funeral of his brother-in-law, an event marked by reflection, grief, and quiet solitude. While in Perth, he stayed at a hotel located just 150 meters from the city's central mosque. At the time, he had no intention of engaging with Islam or visiting the mosque. His visit was entirely familial and personal. But as the days passed, something within him began to stir. Each time he walked by the mosque, he felt an inexplicable pull, something he would later describe as a spiritual magnet. It wasn't just the architecture or the call to prayer. It was something deeper, quieter, and almost indescribable. On one particular day, unable to resist the growing sense of curiosity and inner invitation, he stepped inside the mosque. The moment was simple, but profound. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, sacred, and unlike anything he had experienced before. There, he was greeted by an imam who welcomed him with warmth and ease. Their conversation was natural and respectful, free from any pressure or persuasion. Before leaving, the imam handed him a copy of the Qur'an as a gift, an act of hospitality that would become a pivotal moment in Gould's spiritual journey. Back at his hotel, with the Qur'an in hand, he began to read, not as a scholar, but as a seeker. The words struck him in a way he had never encountered before. Verses that spoke directly to the heart, passages that emphasized the oneness of God, the role of prophets, and the finality of divine guidance through the Qur'an. It wasn't dramatic or emotional at first, but it was steady, compelling, and deeply thought-provoking. In hindsight, he would later reflect that walking into the mosque that day wasn't a coincidence. It was the beginning of a quiet unraveling. where the threads of long-held assumptions and familiar doctrines began to loosen. The encounter in Perth did not instantly change his life, but it opened a door that could no longer be closed. And once opened, that door would lead him to ask deeper questions about his own beliefs, his past religious service, and the essence of truth itself. Although the copy of the Qur'an given to Gould David in Perth initially held his attention, it would soon be placed quietly on a bookshelf, untouched, for months, or perhaps even years. Life continued. He returned to Tasmania, to the rhythms of daily life, to the responsibilities he carried, and to the religious traditions he had long embraced. The Qur'an remained there, visible but unread, resting among other sacred texts and theological works. And yet, it was as if it waited patiently for the right moment. That moment came quietly. There was no crisis, no dramatic revelation, only a quiet stirring within his heart, a growing sense that he needed to revisit the questions that had lingered in his mind for decades. One day, moved by something he could not fully explain, he reached for the Qur'an and opened it with intention, not as a comparative theologian or critic, but as someone sincerely seeking to understand. He later described the moment with striking honesty. "For years I've had a Qur'an on my bookshelf. I barely touched it. But this time, I prostrated and prayed. Then I read the Qur'an, and I realized, intuitively, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, that this was the actual Word of God." That act of prostration was more than a gesture. It was a personal surrender, a turning point. Gould had long known the motions of Christian liturgy, but this moment of sujood, prostration, brought a new kind of intimacy, a direct spiritual posture before God that he had never experienced in the same way. He began to pray earnestly, not out of obligation or tradition, but out of a deep desire for clarity. His prayers became more intense, more focused. Day after day, he asked God, genuinely and without pretense, to show him the truth. Was Islam truly the final path to divine truth, or had he already been walking it within orthodoxy? In private moments, often alone, he placed his heart before God in total sincerity. He did not seek emotional comfort or intellectual validation. He sought truth, whatever it may be. This period of inner struggle was not easy. It involved revisiting decades of belief, service, and identity. It meant examining the doctrines he had once taught and defended, and allowing himself to ask if something greater, something purer, was being shown to him. It was a journey through uncertainty, but also through light. In that sacred process of prayer and reflection, reading and prostration, something changed. What began as curiosity became conviction. What began as internal tension began to settle into clarity. Islam, with its uncompromising message of tawhid, the oneness of God, began to shine not as something foreign, but as something familiar, almost as if it had always been there, waiting quietly beneath the surface of everything he once believed. As Gould David continued to read the Qur'an and reflect on its message, one theme stood out with striking clarity: tawhid, the absolute oneness of God. Unlike the complex theological formulations he had spent years navigating within Christianity, particularly the doctrine of the Trinity, the Quranic message was direct, uncompromising, and deeply resonant. God is one, not divided into persons, not incarnated, not begotten, nor begetting. This truth, repeated throughout the Qur'an with unwavering emphasis, awakened something within him. For decades, the doctrine of the Trinity had quietly troubled him. Though he had accepted it as part of the Orthodox Christian faith, he admits that it was always a source of inner tension. How could God be simultaneously three in one? How could Jesus, a man, also be fully God? These were questions he had asked internally but often left unanswered, relying instead on the authority of church councils and theological tradition. But now, reading the Qur'an, he encountered a view of God that was both transcendent and intimate. beyond comprehension, yet completely singular and free from human attributes. In his own words, Gould later reflected, "I lived much of my religious life based on what the councils had decided, not what I found directly in the scriptures or in personal experience with the divine." This realization hit hard. He began to see that much of his prior belief system had been constructed by theological debates and decisions made centuries after Jesus by church fathers and councils who attempted to reconcile difficult questions through philosophy and compromise. In contrast, the Qur'an offered a return to what felt like a purer, more unfiltered message from God, that there is only one, and nothing is like unto him. The simplicity of Islamic monotheism was not a weakness, it was a profound strength. It answered the questions that had long haunted him, not through mystery, but through clarity. And more than that, it brought peace. A sense that worship could now be directed to the Creator alone, without intermediaries, without philosophical confusion, and without the weight of inherited dogma. This growing certainty in tawhid began to reshape how he saw not only God, but himself, his past, and his future. He was no longer content with inherited theology. He wanted truth that spoke to both heart and reason, and Islam, in its essence, gave him exactly that. After months of quiet reflection, private prayer, and a growing conviction in the truth of Islam, Gould David knew that he could no longer remain in a state of indecision. The truth had become clear to him, both intellectually and spiritually, and the time had come to act on it. Upon returning to Tasmania, he made the most decisive move of his life. In a formal letter addressed to his Orthodox bishop, he announced his conversion to Islam. It was a letter of profound honesty and calm determination. In the letter he wrote, "I have declared the SHAHADA, that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is his final messenger. I have no choice but to obey him." These were not the words of a man rebelling against his past, but of someone who had found clarity, peace, and conviction. With that declaration, he also embraced a new name, Abdul Rahman, meaning servant of the most merciful. The name reflected not only his new faith, but the spirit with which he had arrived at it, through divine mercy, guidance, and deep introspection. Shortly after, he made the Shahada publicly at the Hobart Mosque, following the Friday prayer. Though the moment may have appeared quiet to outsiders, it marked a monumental inner transformation, an end and a beginning all at once. The ceremony itself was simple, but deeply meaningful. Before taking this step, he had consulted via phone with an imam in Perth, the same one who had welcomed him months earlier and gifted him a copy of the Qur'an. That phone call served as a final affirmation, closing the circle that had begun with a casual walk past a mosque and ended with a declaration of faith. Abdul Rahman's acceptance of Islam was not a break from his past, but a fulfillment of a lifelong spiritual journey. It was not a rejection of the values he once held, but a continuation of his search for the one true God, now with a sense of clarity, purpose, and submission that had long eluded him. Unlike many public figures who announce their conversion through dramatic platforms or social media, Gould David, now Abdul Rahman, chose a quiet, respectful approach. He did not seek attention, controversy, or debate. Instead, he sent a formal letter to his Orthodox bishop, informing him directly of his decision to embrace Islam. It was a deeply personal and spiritual matter for him, and he treated it with the humility and seriousness it deserved. This decision was not impulsive, nor was it an act of rebellion. It came after years of introspection and careful thought. He made no public declarations in the media, nor did he try to provoke discussions in religious circles. In many ways, he stepped into Islam the same way he had served his previous faith, quietly, with dignity, and with deep reverence for God. Financially, the transition did not significantly affect his livelihood. Unlike some clergy who rely on church salaries, Abdul Rahman had long worked as a social worker in a hospital setting, earning a living through public service. His professional identity remained intact, and he continued his work with the same compassion and commitment, now grounded in a renewed spiritual perspective. Spiritually, his transition to Islam brought not rupture, but resolution. One of the most remarkable aspects of his story is how he continued to express deep respect and love for Jesus, Isa, and Mary, Maryam, figures he had honored throughout his Orthodox Christian life. But now, through the lens of Islam, he saw them not as divine or intercessors, but as noble servants and chosen individuals of God, revered in their rightful roles. As he once said in private conversation, "In Islam, I did not leave Jesus or Mary. I found them in a place of truth, in the role that best reflects their relationship to Allah." This perspective allowed him to maintain a sense of continuity in his spiritual journey. Islam did not erase his past. It gave him a deeper framework through which he could honor the prophets and spiritual figures he had long admired, without assigning to them divine status. It brought him peace, it gave him clarity, and it allowed him to continue his service to others with a renewed heart. As for the broader church community, reactions were mixed. Some expressed sadness, others confusion, and a few offered quiet understanding. But Abdul Rahman did not seek validation or conflict. His goal was not to convince others, but to live truthfully with what he now believed to be the ultimate message of God. He continued to walk with humility, rooted in a life of service, now accompanied by a new spiritual light. After declaring the Shahada, Abdul Rahman's commitment to Islam only deepened. His conversion was not a symbolic gesture or a quiet retirement into private faith. It was an active embrace of a new way of life. With sincerity and a heart full of gratitude, he began practicing the 5 daily prayers, attending Friday congregational prayers, and immersing himself in the rituals and ethics of his new faith. What stood out most was the genuine enthusiasm with which he approached Islamic worship. His presence in the mosque was not that of a newcomer hesitant at the edges, but of a man who had come home. One of the most powerful milestones in this new chapter of his life was his decision to perform Umrah during the holy month of Ramadan in 2024. The journey took him to the heart of Islam's sacred geography, Makkah, where he performed the rites with quiet awe and reverence. For someone who had once served for decades in Christian ministry, standing in the Haram before the Kaaba was not just a personal spiritual experience, it was a moment of culmination. It marked the closing of one lifelong spiritual quest and the opening of another. His Umrah was not widely publicized, but those close to him described it as deeply moving. It was clear that this was not simply about travel or ritual, it was about spiritual alignment. A man who had once pondered divine mystery through the complex theology of church councils now stood in the simplicity and grandeur of tawhid, declaring the oneness of God among millions of fellow believers. Back home in Hobart, Abdul Rahman became an active presence within the small but welcoming Muslim community. He regularly attended the local mosque, participated in Islamic educational gatherings, and remained in quiet correspondence with imams and fellow converts. While he was never one to seek attention, his story naturally attracted interest among both Muslims and non-Muslims, who admired the grace and clarity with which he carried his journey. Observers and scholars of religion noted that his spiritual transformation was not driven by emotion alone, nor solely by theological argument. Rather, it was a deep integration of both intellect and heart. It was precisely this balance that gave him peace, a sense of spiritual certainty that he had quietly longed for during his years in Christian service. In Islam, he found not only answers, but tranquility. Reflecting on his path, it was clear that Abdul Rahman's journey was not about abandoning faith, but refining it, purifying it, and ultimately surrendering fully to the truth of God's oneness. The peace he found in Islam was not instant, but it was lasting. It grew day by day, prayer by prayer, step by step, from the streets of Hobart to the sacred ground of Makkah. Abdul Rahman's conversion to Islam was not the result of a single emotional moment, nor a sudden disillusionment with his past faith. Rather, it was the culmination of a lifelong spiritual tension, a quiet but persistent questioning that he had carried through decades of Christian devotion. At the heart of this transformation were three deeply interconnected elements: theological dissatisfaction, personal spiritual experience, and a profound encounter with the message of tawhid. Theological dissatisfaction had been growing within him for years, perhaps even longer than he had consciously acknowledged. While he respected the Orthodox tradition and cherished much of its spiritual richness, he could no longer ignore the inconsistencies that troubled him. Chief among them was the doctrine of the Trinity, which he had accepted for most of his life but never fully internalized. It remained, in his words, a theological construct that demanded intellectual submission without emotional conviction. The more he studied the foundations of Orthodox theology, the more he questioned how much of it was grounded in the teachings of Jesus himself and how much came from centuries of ecclesiastical councils and philosophical elaborations that, rather than clarifying the truth, added layers of complexity and dogma. But it was not only reason that drew him toward Islam. Emotion played a powerful role, particularly during that quiet visit to the mosque in Perth. He had not planned to step inside, nor was he seeking any kind of spiritual awakening. And yet, the moment he entered, he felt something he could not explain, a sense of being called, as though something sacred was gently pulling him inward. That feeling intensified during his later prostrations, moments in which he lowered himself in complete humility before God, without intermediaries or ritual hierarchy. These were moments of truth, not because they brought theological answers, but because they brought spiritual certainty. He later described them as encounters with a truth that had always been waiting for him, just beneath the surface of his lifelong search. The final and most enduring factor in his conversion was his encounter with the Qur'an's message of tawhid, the pure, undivided oneness of God. It was not merely the simplicity of the concept that moved him, but the intellectual clarity and emotional resonance with which it was expressed. The Qur'an did not ask him to accept mysteries that could not be explained. It called him to recognize the Creator as one, without partner, without form, without need. This message answered not only his theological doubts, but also his deepest spiritual longings. In Islam, he reflected, I found a God who is both majestic and merciful, utterly transcendent, yet closer to me than my own breath. This realization gave him peace. For the first time in his spiritual life, his mind and heart were aligned. He no longer had to navigate paradoxes or defend dogmas he could not fully believe. Islam gave him permission to stand before God in full sincerity, as a servant, no longer confused, no longer torn between tradition and truth. In the end, Abdul Rahman did not convert to Islam to reject his past, but to complete his journey, a journey that began in the pews of Orthodox churches, passed through years of reflection and service, and arrived, by divine permission, at the doorstep of a mosque in Perth, where a simple act of curiosity became the spark of transformation. Abdul Rahman's decision to embrace Islam resonated deeply across the communities he touched, but in very different ways. Within the Muslim community, his story was met with warmth, admiration, and heartfelt support. Converts from other religious traditions often inspire curiosity, but when the person is someone who had once dedicated his life to religious service, the impact is more profound. Abdul Rahman's journey was not just a personal transformation. It became, for many Muslims, a living testament to the power of sincere spiritual seeking. His path to Islam affirmed that truth, when searched for earnestly, will reveal itself, even after decades of walking another road. His quiet dignity, his refusal to create division or provoke conflict, and his thoughtful, well-articulated reflections on theology and personal experience made his story all the more inspiring. Muslims across Australia and beyond saw in him an example of what it means to follow one's conscience with humility and strength. At the same time, the reaction within the Orthodox Christian community in Tasmania was more complex. The local Orthodox population had long been small and for years lacked a permanent priest. In many ways, Gould David had served as a spiritual anchor, more by presence than by title. So, while his formal role in the church may have been limited, his departure still marked the end of a quiet era. For those who had shared prayers and community life with him, the news of his conversion likely brought sadness, confusion, or even a sense of loss. However, the broader Orthodox structure, aware of the small and informal nature of the Tasmanian community, may not have viewed his departure as a theological crisis. Rather, it was understood as a personal decision from someone who had always walked a somewhat independent spiritual path, guided more by conviction than conformity. Some voices within Orthodox circles expressed concern or disappointment, but overall, the reaction was muted, perhaps in part because his journey had always been grounded in sincerity and peace, not protest or public rejection. For Muslims, however, Abdul Rahman's story carried symbolic and spiritual weight. It served as a reminder that guidance can reach anyone, regardless of background, position, or tradition. His conversion was not merely about adopting a new faith, but about embodying the universal human journey toward truth, clarity, and peace. In a time when religious labels often divide and institutional boundaries define identity, his quiet crossing from one tradition to another reminded people that the heart's search transcends such walls. And in that crossing, Abdul Rahman found not just a new community, but a renewed connection with God. Gould David, now known as Abdul Rahman, was never simply a former Orthodox priest. He was, above all, a man on a lifelong spiritual journey. For more than 4 decades, he lived a life devoted to serving others through faith, rooted in Christian tradition, yet always quietly questioning, always seeking something deeper. His conversion to Islam between 2022 and 2023 was not a sudden rupture, but rather the culmination of a slow, honest, and courageous journey that had begun many years before. His decision to embrace Islam came after a profound inner calling, a quiet moment outside a mosque in Perth, a sincere prayer, a returned glance to the Qur'an he had once left untouched. It was there, in those private moments of surrender and clarity, that he found the courage to step forward, to acknowledge the truth he could no longer deny. At its core, his story is one of rediscovery, of faith, identity, and the oneness of God. It is a deeply human story marked by humility and transformation. The journey of Abdul Rahman stands as a powerful reminder that no matter one's background, age, or religious role, the heart's search for truth remains timeless. In Islam, he found what he had long sought, the simplicity and certainty of tawhid, the unshakable belief in the oneness of God. Today, his life continues in quiet devotion, not as a public figure or religious authority, but as a humble servant of the Most Merciful, living the next chapter of his spiritual life with peace and purpose. His story is not just a conversion. It is a testament to the human soul's capacity for change, for sincerity, and for finding light, even after a lifetime of walking a different path. Thanks for watching until the end. I hope it was useful. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.